The morning of June 19th, 1944 began with radar contacts appearing on screens aboard American carriers 130 miles west of Guam. 480 F6F Hellcats were airborne on combat air patrol, or being scrambled, from 15 carriers of Task Force 58. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet had launched its first wave. 69 aircraft heading toward the American fleet. The Japanese formation included Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, a coordinated strike intended to sink American carriers and shift the balance of the Pacific War. What those Japanese pilots didn't know was that every movement of their formation was being tracked by American radar. The combat information centers aboard American carriers plotted their course, altitude, and speed. Fighter directors issued vectors to Hellcat formations, positioning them precisely to intercept the incoming raid before it reached the carriers. This wasn't guesswork or luck. This was systematic coordination of detection, communication, and fighter direction that Japanese forces couldn't match. At 70 miles from Task Force 58, the Japanese formation encountered the first American fighters. Hellcats, diving from altitude advantage, hit the formation from multiple angles simultaneously. Japanese pilots tried to maintain formation discipline. Zero escorts attempted to protect the bombers, but the Americans attacked from positions of advantage, fired, disengaged, then repositioned for follow-up attacks. The Japanese formation began disintegrating under coordinated assault. Of 69 aircraft in that first wave, 42 were shot down. 27 turned back or were scattered. 0 Japanese bombs hit American carriers. The engagement lasted less than an hour. 1 Hellcat was lost. The pilot recovered by destroyer escort. The second wave was larger, 109 aircraft. American radar detected them at 120 miles range. Fighter directors positioned Hellcats for intercept. The pattern repeated. American fighters attacked from altitude, used speed and power to dictate engagement terms, refused to fight except where they held advantage. 70 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 4 reached the American carriers, near misses only. No hits. All 4 were shot down by anti-aircraft fire. By day's end, Japanese losses exceeded 346 carrier aircraft destroyed. American losses were 30 aircraft. Most pilots recovered. The kill ratio was 11-1 for the entire day's combat. Navy aircrews nicknamed the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The statistics told a story, but the statistics didn't capture what had actually happened. Japanese pilots had launched that morning, believing they were flying conventional strike missions against an enemy who fought the same way they did. Individual skill would matter, courage would matter, maneuverability would matter. Instead, they encountered something entirely different. A coordinated defense system that detected them at extreme range, calculated their course and speed with precision, positioned interceptors perfectly, and destroyed them in carefully orchestrated engagements that left no room for individual skill to compensate. Lieutenant Commander Alex Vratu, already an ace with 9 kills, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft during the Philippine Sea battle. His account of the action was matter-of-fact. They were well-organized formations, but once we hit them from above, they scattered. After that, it was just a matter of chasing them down one by one. When asked about Japanese pilot skill, Vratu was blunt. Some were good, some weren't. It didn't matter much. We had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and there were a lot of us. They never really had a chance. That last assessment captured the reality. Individual Japanese pilot skill, which had been decisive in 1942 and early 1943, had become largely irrelevant by mid-1944, not because Japanese pilots had become less skilled, though pilot quality was declining as experienced veterans died faster than training programs could replace them, but because the systematic advantages American forces possessed, better aircraft, better tactics, better coordination, overwhelming numerical superiority, meant that even skilled Japanese pilots couldn't overcome structural disadvantages. David McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's leading ace with 34 victories, all in Hellcats, described the aircraft's significance simply. It was an outstanding fighter plane. It performed well, was easy to fly, and was a steady weapons stage. But what I really remember most was that it was tough and simple to maintain. That last point mattered more than dramatic combat stories suggested. A fighter that could be maintained easily by carrier deck crews under combat conditions meant more aircraft available for missions. More aircraft available meant more chances to engage the enemy. More engagements meant more kills. The Hellcat's maintainability contributed directly to its combat success. Production numbers revealed the industrial advantage American forces enjoyed. Grumman's Bethpage plant, number 3, Long Island, produced 12,275 Hellcats in 30 months. At peak production, one complete aircraft rolled off the assembly line every hour, around the clock. Much of the factory was still under construction when the first F6Fs were being assembled inside. This production rate was possible because the Hellcat was designed for efficient manufacture, standardized components, minimal specialized tooling, design simplicity that allowed rapid assembly by workers with modest training. Japan couldn't match this output. Japanese aircraft industry produced approximately 7.8 million tons of military equipment in 1943. The United States produced 90 million tons. One complete escort carrier was being launched every 70 days. By mid-1944, American carriers operated more fighters than Japan could field across all its forces combined. This industrial disparity shaped every engagement. When American fighters were shot down, replacements arrived within weeks. When pilots were lost, trained replacements graduated from flight schools in steady streams. When carriers were damaged, repair facilities brought them back to service. Japanese losses couldn't be replaced at comparable rates. Every veteran pilot killed represented irreplaceable experience. Every aircraft destroyed strained production capacity, already inadequate for wartime needs. The pilot training gap widened catastrophically through 1944. Pre-war Japanese naval aviators had received 2 years of intensive training before operational assignment. They were superbly skilled professionals. But those veterans were dying in combat, and the training pipeline couldn't maintain quality while expanding quantity. By mid-1944, replacement Japanese pilots received 3 to 4 months of training before combat assignment. They were brave and determined, but they lacked the experience to survive against battle-hardened American pilots who had developed systematic tactics through continuous combat. American pilot training emphasized standardized procedures and coordinated tactics over individual brilliance. New pilots learned to follow doctrine, work as teams, exploit their aircraft's advantages, and avoid disadvantageous engagements. This systematic approach meant that even relatively inexperienced American pilots could achieve success by following established procedures. Japanese training still emphasized individual skill and fighting spirit, admirable qualities, but insufficient against opponents who fought as coordinated teams using systematic tactics. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio reflected these multiple factors: superior aircraft performance, better tactics, systematic coordination through radar and fighter direction, overwhelming numerical advantage, better pilot training focused on practical combat procedures, industrial capacity to replace losses. None of these factors alone would have been decisive. Together, they created a compound advantage that Japanese forces couldn't overcome through courage or individual skill. Specific engagements illustrated the pattern. On February 17th and 18th, 1944, during carrier strikes on a Truk, Hellcats from 10 squadrons destroyed 127 Japanese aircraft in the air and 86 on the ground. On March 29th and 30th, during strikes on Palau, similar devastation, over and over. The pattern repeated. American carriers appeared, launched massive strikes. Hellcats swept defending fighters from the sky. Bombers attacked ground targets without opposition. Task force withdrew, moved to next target. Japanese commanders understood what was happening, but couldn't develop effective counter-tactics. The fundamental problem was that American forces held initiative. They chose when and where to engage. They concentrated overwhelming force at selected points. They exploited technological and tactical advantages systematically. Japanese forces reacted to American moves, but couldn't seize initiative, couldn't concentrate sufficient forces, couldn't overcome American advantages, even when fighting spirit remained strong. Vice Admiral Ozawa's plan for the Philippine Sea battle had been tactically sound according to pre-war doctrine. Use carrier aircraft with longer range to strike American carriers from beyond their response range. Coordinate with land-based aircraft from Guam and nearby islands to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Inflict sufficient damage to disrupt American offensive operations, buying time for defensive reinforcements. The plan failed not because it was poorly conceived, but because it was based on assumptions no longer valid by mid-1944. American aircraft weren't operating at extreme range anymore. Task Force 58 had closed to within strike range deliberately. Land-based aircraft from Guam had been largely destroyed by American strikes days before the carrier battle. Japanese carrier aircraft couldn't penetrate American defenses organized around radar direction and coordinated fighter interception. Every assumption underlying Ozawa's plan collapsed under contact with reality. The consequences extended beyond tactical defeats. After the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese carrier forces were effectively finished as strategic assets. Not immediately. Carriers still existed, aircraft could still be embarked, but the combination of aircraft losses, pilot losses, and recognition that carrier operations couldn't succeed against American defenses meant Japanese carriers would never again threaten American operations meaningfully. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Ozawa used his remaining carriers as decoys to lure American carriers away from invasion beaches. The carriers had few aircraft, few experienced pilots. They were hollow shells, serving as bait. American carriers destroyed them easily. Ozawa survived again, but his career as an offensive carrier commander was effectively over. The Hellcats' dominance established patterns that shaped the war's final year. American forces advanced toward Japan. Supported by carriers operating Hellcats, Japanese air resistance was systematically destroyed. By early 1945, American carriers operated off the Japanese home islands with relative impunity, striking targets that had been invulnerable 2 years earlier. The final kill statistics were compiled after war's end. F6F Hellcats were credited with 5,156 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 75% of all aerial victories achieved by United States Navy and Marine Corps forces during the Pacific War. The 19-to-1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat was calculated based on 270 Hellcats lost to enemy fighters versus 5,163 confirmed kills. These numbers represented the most lopsided victory in modern aerial warfare history. Individual aces achieved remarkable records. David McCampbell with 34 kills, all in Hellcats. Cecil Harris with 24. Eugene Valencia with 23. Patrick Fleming with 19. 306 Hellcat pilots became aces. Pilots with 5 or more confirmed kills. The Hellcat produced more aces than any other aircraft type in World War II. This wasn't coincidence. The aircraft's capabilities, combined with systematic tactics and numerical advantage, created conditions where success was probable rather than exceptional. But focusing on individual aces obscures the larger pattern. The Hellcat's success came from institutional competence more than individual heroism. Thousands of Hellcat pilots who never achieved ace status contributed to victory by following doctrine, maintaining formation discipline, exploiting tactical advantages, and refusing disadvantageous engagements. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense. No dramatic dogfights, no desperate last stands. They were professionals executing systematic procedures that methodically destroyed enemy air power through cumulative effect. The human cost of this success, measured from the Japanese perspective, was catastrophic. Japan began the war with approximately 3,500 trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, fewer than 1,000 experienced pilots remained. After the Philippine Sea battle, Japan's naval aviation training pipeline collapsed under the weight of irreplaceable losses. Replacement pilots thrown into combat with minimal training were slaughtered. The fatalism, visible in Japanese pilot diaries from late 1944, reflected recognition that survival was impossible, that death was certain, that the only question was whether that death would accomplish anything. The kamikaze phenomenon emerged partly from this recognition. If conventional attacks couldn't penetrate American defenses, perhaps suicide attacks could guarantee hits. If well-trained pilots were no longer available, perhaps barely trained pilots could fly one-way missions requiring only ability to point aircraft at targets. The desperation underlying these tactics revealed how completely American systematic dominance had overturned the balance of aerial combat. Post-war analysis by American and Japanese historians confirmed what combat statistics suggested. The Zero's design philosophy, eliminate everything unnecessary for turning combat, was brilliant when both sides fought blind, when engagements began at visual range, when individual pilot skill in dogfighting determined outcomes. But when Americans developed tactics that made turning combat irrelevant, when radar allowed detection beyond visual range, when systematic coordination allowed positioning fighters for advantageous engagements, the Zero's design strengths became irrelevant, and its weaknesses, lack of armor, vulnerability to damage, poor high-speed handling, became fatal. The Hellcat's design philosophy, build an aircraft that could dictate engagement terms, proved decisive precisely because it allowed Americans to fight on terms favoring their strengths, not faster than the Zero at low altitude, not more maneuverable, not longer ranged, but faster where it mattered, at combat altitudes above 15,000 feet, more powerful, allowing better climb rate, better protected, allowing pilots to survive hits, well-armed enough that hits meant kills against unarmored opponents. These characteristics, exploited through systematic tactics, made dogfighting unnecessary and Japanese maneuverability irrelevant. The lesson extended beyond the specific aircraft. Modern warfare had entered an era where systematic integration of technology, tactics, and institutional capacity mattered more than individual weapons or warriors. The side with better systems, detection, coordination, logistics, training, production, would defeat the side with better individual components. Individual skill still mattered, but systematic competence mattered more. British military historian John Keegan, analyzing the Pacific Air War decades later, noted that the Hellcat versus Zero contest demonstrated the triumph of systematic thinking over brilliant improvisation. Japanese engineers had built something brilliant, the finest dogfighter of the era. American engineers had built something systematic, an integrated weapons system designed to make dogfighting obsolete. When these philosophies collided, systematic thinking won decisively. The F6F Hellcat remained in frontline American service through war's end. Final production was completed in November 1945, just after Japan's surrender. Post-war, Hellcats were phased out of frontline carrier operations, replaced by more advanced fighters like the F8F Bearcat and jet-powered aircraft. But Hellcats continued serving in secondary roles through the 1950s. The French Navy used Hellcats in Indochina. Some served as drones, carrying bombs against North Korean targets during the Korean War. The last American military, F6F, was retired in 1954. 17 complete F6F Hellcats exist today in museums and private collections worldwide. 6 are airworthy. 3 fly regularly at air shows. These surviving aircraft are maintained by dedicated crews who understand the historical significance of preserving examples of the fighter that destroyed Japanese naval aviation and helped secure American victory in the Pacific. The Hellcat's legacy extends beyond its combat record. It demonstrated that modern warfare rewards systematic thinking, integration of technology, tactics, training, and logistics over individual brilliance. It proved that industrial capacity matters as much as design genius. It showed that institutional competence defeats individual skill when systematic advantages are exploited methodically. Japanese pilots who survived the war and American pilots who flew against them shared mutual respect for opponent courage and skill. But both sides recognized that by mid-1944, individual courage and skill couldn't overcome systematic advantages. The side with better systems, better coordination, better logistics, and overwhelming production capacity would win regardless of individual warrior quality. The F6F Hellcat embodied this truth. Not the fastest fighter, not the most maneuverable, not the longest ranged, but the most effective because it was designed to exploit advantages that mattered in actual combat conditions, supported by tactics that maximized those advantages, produced in quantities that overwhelmed opposition, maintained easily enough to keep operational readiness high, and flown by pilots trained in systematic procedures that worked. When the title claims Japanese pilots laughed at slow Hellcats, the historical record shows this wasn't quite accurate. Japanese intelligence officers recognized early that the F6F represented a serious threat, but the perception that maneuverability and turning performance were the dominant factors in air combat, a perception validated by 2 years of zero dominance, led some Japanese pilots to underestimate an aircraft that couldn't turn with them. That underestimation cost Japan its carrier aviation capability and thousands of experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. The 19-to-1 kill ratio wasn't achieved through any single factor. Superior aircraft, yes, but also superior tactics, better coordination through radar and fighter direction, overwhelming numerical advantage, better pilot training, industrial capacity to replace losses, better maintenance keeping, more aircraft operational. These advantages compounded. Together, they created a systematic dominance the Japanese forces couldn't overcome through courage, skill, or determination. The morning of June 19th, 1944, when radar operators detected that first Japanese strike incoming toward Task Force 58, they triggered a battle that effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as a strategic force. The battle lasted 1 day. The outcome was determined by capabilities developed over 2 years of systematic learning, engineering, training, and tactical refinement. The Hellcat wasn't the cause of Japanese defeat. That defeat stemmed from multiple factors. But the F6F Hellcat was the instrument through which American naval aviation achieved air superiority, so complete that Japanese forces never recovered. That remains the aircraft's historical significance. Not that it was beloved by pilots who flew it, though it was. Not that it produced more aces than any other fighter, though it did. But that it represented systematic thinking about modern warfare applied to the problem of achieving air superiority. The result was the most successful carrier fighter in history, measured by the only metric that ultimately mattered, the ability to destroy enemy forces while preserving friendly forces at a ratio that made sustained operations possible. 19 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Hellcat lost in air combat. 75% of all Navy aerial victories during the Pacific War, 12,000 produced, 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. These numbers tell the story of an aircraft that changed the war not through brilliance or innovation in any single area, but through systematic integration of multiple advantages into a weapon system that worked consistently in the conditions where it actually had to fight. The Japanese laughed at Hellcats being too slow to turn with zeros. The Americans built an aircraft that made turning irrelevant. When those philosophies collided over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945, systematic thinking defeated brilliant improvisation. The 19-to-1 kill ratio was the final verdict on which approach worked better in modern warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.